this, you'll notice the slide that you're seeing depicts some U.S. Army soldiers on horseback. If you notice, several of them have their rifles pointed upright. In the distance, one soldier carries the American flag. If you look even closer, you'll notice the men on horseback are African American soldiers. We know them as the Buffalo Soldiers. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. We're the South Texas Buffalo Soldiers Association, representing the 10th Cavalry K Troop, and it's our pleasure and honor to be here to give you a presentation about the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, particularly covering the Indian War period from 1866 to 1890. The slide you're seeing here is a visual representation timeline of the period that we'll be covering. You'll notice several key milestones as it pertains to the Buffalo Soldiers' accomplishments during this era, which we will talk about in more detail. This is an overview of what we're going to cover. We'll give you an introduction about who we are, who our members are, our mission, some of the projects that we've done. We'll talk about the Buffalo Soldier background history, talk about the foundation of the Buffalo Soldiers, and we'll look at the 9th and 10th Cavalry, since we are a cavalry organization, and we'll look at the Western frontier expansion as it pertains to the accomplishments of the Buffalo Soldiers during this era. And of course, we'll look at the Buffalo Soldier legacy, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers that you may have for us. The South Texas Buffalo Soldiers Association was established on January 21st, 2018. We're registered officially in Bexar County as a 501c3 organization. I'd like to introduce the members of the South Texas Buffalo Soldiers Association. To my immediate right is Trooper Ricardo Allen, our Chief Executive Coordinator. To my left is Trooper Wayne Austin, our Vice President and Treasurer. And myself, I'm Trooper Roderick Pat Patterson, serving as President. Now, the mission of the South Texas Buffalo Soldiers Association is to educate the general public on the historical accomplishments of the Buffalo Soldiers, particularly focusing on the Indian War period from 1866 to 1890. Our secondary mission is that of mentoring the youth. And what we do is we draw upon the experiences of the Buffalo Soldiers in that they faced many adverse situations, and they were able to overcome adversity. And so we think this is a great paradigm for our youth to follow and draw back in a historical context. We also have done several projects. We've gone to several elementary schools, briefing on the Buffalo Soldier history, wearing our authentic uniforms as you see in the picture. And we also have done a special project working with the African American Network during a presentation from several weeks ago on the Buffalo Soldier history. Now, to go back before the Buffalo Soldiers' inception, one has to understand what was the role even before the Buffalo Soldiers came into being. It really goes back to the early Republic. And when I say early Republic, I'm referring to the time of the American Revolution, when we were fighting for independence from Great Britain. African American soldiers stepped up to the challenge back then, fighting for our liberty, and General George Washington commended them for their bravery. Several decades later, we again fought the British in the War of 1812, and again, African American soldiers stepped up to the challenge of fighting with gallantry, which was acknowledged by then General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Well, the United States history is not without many conflicts, so several decades after the War of 1812, you had President Lincoln, who was elected in 1860. This caused a lot of contention with several southern states who, in December of 1860, seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Several months later, in April of 1861, Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort at that time, thus beginning what we know as the American Civil War. The war ensued for about a year as Union soldiers in 1862 took on more heavy casualties. As a consequence of that action, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1862. What the act did was a couple of things. First, it allowed states of the Union to legitimately conscript within their states to support the federal forces. And second, it opened up the door for African Americans to serve in both the Army and the Navy. Now, what's a really interesting point in this period is that this became a very pivotal moment for African Americans because this becomes the first large-scale influx of African Americans fighting in the military. The Militia Act of 1862 also did something else. It allowed the War Department to issue General Order Number 143, which created the United States Colored Troops. Some 175 regiments were formed, most of them being infantry as part of the United States Colored Troops, and some 180,000 black soldiers fought in the Civil War. Of that number, 33,000 gave their lives in fighting for freedom. Initially, when black soldiers came into the Union Army, they were paid $10 a month compared to their white counterparts who were paid $13 a month. But towards the end of the war, that changed, and they ultimately ended up being paid $13 a month. Well, the Civil War lasted for about 4 years, from April of 1861 through April of 1865. And of course, General Lee, who was commander of the Confederate forces, surrendered to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in April of 1865. Between April 1865 through December, the Army significantly reduced its manpower from well over 1 million men down to about 55,000 officers and enlisted men. Concurrent with that, during that time frame, you have many people east of the Mississippi who decided to emigrate west of the Mississippi, settling in the Great Plains and the Intermountain region. This would present a problem in that they would be encroaching on Native American lands. This would become a big challenge for the downsized United States Army during the post-Civil War era. At this time, Trooper Austin will talk more about the follow-on of the post-Civil War Army.
In the years following the American Civil War, the U.S. economy and infrastructure were left in ruins, and the U.S. military was struggling to meet the challenges that was about to encounter on the western frontier. Many debates and a series of compromises were proposed, and a remedy was presented in the Congressional Act of 1866. While this act actually called for the formation of 10 new cavalry units and 45 infantry, it is the language in Section 3 of that act that formed the foundation for what we know now as the Buffalo Soldiers. Out of the 10 total cavalries, 2 of them contained all black enlisted men, and out of the 45 infantry regiment, 2 contained all black enlisted men. The act actually specified that all of the officers had to be white, and these officers must be battlefield experienced, and they must pass a written examination, be approved by a board of officers, and they must be volunteers. Needless to say, there was not a list of qualified officers to take this offer. And some officers even took lower rank in white units just not to serve with the Buffalo Soldiers. Early in August 1866, General Grant telegraphed General Sheridan and General Sherman, ordering them to proceed with the enlistment of the black soldiers to formulate the regiments. General Sherman commanded the Army Missouri Division, and he was ordered to begin the recruitment in the north, while General Sheridan commanded the Southern Division, the Gulf Division, and he was ordered to start in the south. The new regiments were designated as the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry Regiments. Colonel Edward Hatch was chosen to lead the 9th, and Colonel Benjamin Garrison of Illinois was chosen to lead the 10th Regiment. While Hatch and Grierson were excellent military officers, they had difficult recruiting qualified officers to fill the 25 staff positions in each regiment. A full strength of the Army regiment contained about 1,200 enlisted men and about 25 officers. The recruit would not provide adequate horses and equipment to train, and this caused some delays in reaching their training objectives. There were many shortages in training, but the recruits, there was no shortage in young Negroes eager to enlist in the United States Army. The $13 a month, food, shelter, clothing were more than any of them could hope for as a civilian. They came from all backgrounds. There was cooks, farmers, teamsters, former slaves, freedmen, and they all came in droves to become members of the United States Army. Now we're going to continue our discussion with further information from Trooper Allen.
The 9th Cavalry was formed at Greenville, Louisiana. That's located right outside of New Orleans. It became a recruiting area for troops. Initially deployed to San Antonio with 8 companies, with 2 more deployed to the Rio Grande. If you know where San Antonio College is, right across the street is San Pedro Springs. It's the park. That's where the 9th headquarters were formed. The reason they were formed there was because of the water source. Okay, that spring is constant running. Even today, as we speak, that water is pure and the springs still run. Colonel Edward Hatch, Commander, 9th Cavalry, former Civil War veteran from the 2nd U.S. Cavalry of Iowa. He was a graduate of Norwich Military Academy in Vermont. Deployments: South Texas, patrolled along the Rio Grande for 8 years. West Texas, to Fort Davis and Fort Stockton in the summer of 1867. Protected the stagecoach lines between San Antonio and El Paso. Soldiers confronted hundreds of miles of brush jungle, vast deserts, areas, mountains, dealt with extreme temperatures and extreme cold. As you see us wearing this uniform during the summer, if you imagine being in a wool uniform of this type